Hello and welcome everyone to another fascinating episode of Background Interview. I'm your host, Lily, and I'm absolutely thrilled to be here with you today. In our show, we invite remarkable figures from throughout history to share their stories, perspectives, and wisdom that we might not have heard before. This program is perfect for those of you listening while commuting, doing household chores, or working on other tasks. It's designed to enrich your mind and broaden your perspectives while fitting seamlessly into your busy lives. Our aim is to provide both entertainment and intellectual stimulation in one delightful package. I'm excited to mention that our show is now broadcast in 12 languages worldwide, reaching listeners in every corner of the globe. And yes, that includes you. Isn't that amazing? So how are you all feeling today? I hope you're having a wonderful day so far. Speaking of days, I had such a morning myself. I was running late for the studio, coffee in hand, when I bumped into someone on the subway. The coffee went flying, and would you believe it? It landed perfectly into the open bag of a businessman reading his newspaper. He looked up, and I was mortified, but then he just smiled and said, Thanks for the delivery, but I ordered a croissant. But enough about my coffee mishaps. Today, we have an absolutely extraordinary guest. Someone whose name you certainly know, but whose full story remains shrouded in controversy, misunderstanding, and profound theological complexity. A figure whose actions changed the course of history, yet whose motivations have been debated for millennia. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming one of the 12 disciples of Jesus Christ, the man known throughout history as the betrayer, Judas Iscariot.
Thank you, though I'm not sure I deserve such a warm welcome.
Please, let's both take a seat. Make yourself comfortable, if that's possible after so long.
Well, it's strange, to say the least, to be here, to speak. My name has been synonymous with betrayal for over 2,000 years. I am Judas Iscariot, once the treasurer among the 12 disciples who followed Jesus of Nazareth, the one who identified him with a kiss in the Garden of Gethsemane, leading to his arrest and crucifixion, the one who received 30 pieces of silver for this act, the one who, consumed by remorse, returned the money and took my own life. That is who I am, or at least, who history remembers me to be.
I must admit, when my producers told me you were coming on the show, I had this strange moment where I wondered if I should hide my wallet. Sorry, terrible joke. Judas, I'd like to start at the beginning of your story. How did you first meet Jesus, and what was it about him that drew you to become one of his followers?
It's a fair question. I met Jesus in Galilee during the early days of his ministry. I was different from the other disciples in many ways. More educated perhaps, more politically aware. I came from Kerioth, that's what Iscariot means. Man from Kerioth, a town in Judea, while most of the others were Galileans.
So you were an outsider from the start?
In a sense, yes. But what drew me to Jesus? There was something undeniable about him. His words carried weight. When he spoke of the kingdom of God, I heard the promise of liberation, not just spiritual but perhaps political too. Remember, we lived under Roman occupation. Many of us hoped for a Messiah who would restore Israel, who would overthrow our oppressors.
Was that your primary motivation? Political revolution?
I'd be lying if I said it wasn't part of it, but there was more. His compassion was disarming. I saw him touch lepers, when no one else would go near them. I watched him speak to women, to Samaritans, to tax collectors, to all those whom society had pushed aside. And there was a power in him. The healings I witnessed, they were undeniable.
What was Jesus like, personally? The human being behind the theological figure?
He laughed more than people realize. That's something the Gospels don't capture, his laughter. He had this way of telling stories that would suddenly make everything clear. And his eyes, when he looked at you, it felt like he was seeing everything, every fault, every fear, every hope. Yet there was no judgment there. It was unnerving, actually.
How so?
Because most of us prefer to keep parts of ourselves hidden, don't we? But with him, it felt impossible. And yet, despite seeing all of me, the ambition, the doubt, the calculation, he still called me to follow him. That was the most disarming thing of all.
You mentioned being the group's treasurer. How did that come about?
I had experience with money. I could read, write, keep accounts. Most of the others were fishermen, a tax collector, ordinary men. It made sense for me to manage what little funds we had. We lived simply, but there were still needs: food, occasional lodging, alms for the poor. Jesus was insistent about caring for the poor.
Was that responsibility a burden or a privilege?
Both. It gave me purpose, a defined role, but it also set me apart. And there's a certain intimacy in knowing exactly what everyone has, what everyone gives, what everyone takes. You learn much about people's character when you manage their money.
What was daily life like following Jesus?
Exhausting, exhilarating. We walked everywhere, you know, miles and miles under the Middle Eastern sun, slept under the stars more often than not, ate when food was available, went hungry when it wasn't, but there was this energy, this sense that we were part of something momentous.
And your relationships with the other disciples? Were you close with any of them in particular?
Not particularly, no. There were inner circles even among the 12. Peter, James, and John were closest to Jesus. I was tolerated. Respected for my function, perhaps, but not embraced as a brother the way others were. John's gospel calls me a thief, claims I stole from the money box. That's not true. I was meticulous with those accounts.
Do you think the others sensed something in you? Something that made them keep their distance?
Perhaps. Or perhaps I kept my distance from them. I found their simplicity frustrating at times. They were good men, but many of them couldn't see beyond the miracle of the moment, to the larger implications of what was happening, the political realities we faced.
Let's talk about those political realities. What was happening in Judea and Galilee at that time?
Tension. Constant tension. The Romans controlled everything. Their soldiers patrolled our streets, their taxes drained our resources, their crosses lined our roads, a warning to anyone who might resist. The religious authorities, the Sanhedrin, the high priest, maintained an uneasy balance, collaborating enough to preserve what autonomy they could, while avoiding direct confrontation.
And where did Jesus fit into this complex situation?
That's the question, isn't it? That's the very question I kept asking myself. He spoke of the kingdom of God as present, as now, yet nothing seemed to change in the world around us. He had power, real power. I saw him calm storms, multiply food, heal the sick, even raise the dead, but he wouldn't use that power to bring about the change we so desperately needed.
What kind of change were you hoping for?
Freedom, justice, the restoration of Israel. The prophecies speak of the Messiah as a king, a liberator. When Jesus rode into Jerusalem on that donkey, with people laying palm branches before him and shouting, "Hosanna," I thought, finally, it's beginning. But then he went to the temple and overturned the tables of the money changers, creating chaos, yes, but no revolution. It was a symbolic act, not a strategic one.
Were you disappointed?
Profoundly. I began to wonder if I had misunderstood everything, if perhaps he wasn't who I thought he was, who we all thought he was.
What about his teachings? Surely there were aspects of his message that resonated with you.
Of course. His emphasis on caring for the marginalized, his challenges to religious hypocrisy, his vision of a world governed by love rather than power. These things moved me deeply. There was a line he said once, "What does it profit a man to gain the whole world but lose his soul?" That haunted me. Still haunts me.
Did you ever discuss your doubts or your different vision with Jesus directly?
Not as directly as I should have. There were moments. When Mary poured that expensive perfume on his feet, I objected, saying it could have been sold and the money given to the poor. John's Gospel claims I said this because I was greedy, but that's not true. It genuinely seemed wasteful to me. Jesus rebuked me publicly. Said the poor you will always have with you, but you will not always have me.
How did that make you feel?
Confused. Hurt. It seemed to contradict everything he'd taught about caring for those in need. It was as if he was saying, I matter more than they do, and maybe he did. Maybe he was right to prioritize himself if he truly was the Son of God, but in that moment, it felt like watching a different man than the one I'd chosen to follow.
When did you first begin to contemplate betraying him?
I don't think I ever thought of it as betrayal. Not really. That's the narrative that took hold afterward. In my mind, I was forcing his hand, creating a situation where he would have to reveal his power, assert his messiahship. If he was arrested, surely then he would finally act. The people would rally around him. The revolution would begin.
So in your mind, you weren't ending his ministry, but catalyzing it.
Yes. At least, that's what I told myself. But there was anger too, I can't deny that. Disappointment. A sense of having wasted years of my life, following someone who ultimately wasn't what I needed him to be.
What about the money? The 30 pieces of silver?
The silver was incidental. The Gospels make much of it, linking it to prophecies from Zechariah. 30 pieces was the price of a slave. A pittance, really. I didn't do it for the money. But when it was offered, I took it. Perhaps to justify to myself what I was already planning to do. Perhaps out of spite.
Let's talk about that night. The Last Supper. Jesus said someone would betray him. What went through your mind when he said that?
Shock. Absolute shock. Not that he knew, he always seemed to know what was in people's hearts, but that he said it aloud, in front of everyone. When he dipped the bread and handed it to me, our eyes met. There was such sadness there, such profound sadness, but no anger. He told me, what you are about to do quickly. And I left.
Did the others suspect?
No, John's Gospel claims they thought I was going to give money to the poor, or buy something for the festival. The irony isn't lost on me.
And then the Garden of Gethsemane. The kiss.
Yes. I had told the soldiers I would identify him with a kiss. It was dark. They needed to be sure they arrested the right man. A kiss, a normal greeting between friends, between teacher and student. But in that context, it became the ultimate symbol of treachery.
What did Jesus say to you?
Friend, do what you came for. Friend. Even then, he called me friend. And then, Judas, are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss? He knew. He always knew. Yet he did nothing to stop it. That's what I still don't understand. If he knew what was coming, why didn't he flee? Why didn't he fight? Why did he seem to accept it?
What happened after the arrest?
I watched from a distance as they took him away. I expected something. Lightning from heaven. Angels. His own display of power. The other disciples rising up. The crowds who had welcomed him days before coming to his defense. But there was nothing. Just a man being led away to his execution.
That must have been devastating.
It was worse than that. It was the collapse of everything I believed. Everything I had built my life around for years. I realized then what I had done. Not forced the revelation, but sentenced an innocent man to death. The weight of that. I couldn't bear it.
So you returned the money?
I tried to. I went to the chief priests, told them I had sinned, that I had betrayed innocent blood. They dismissed me. What is that to us? That's your responsibility. They were right, of course. The responsibility was mine. I threw the silver pieces into the temple and left.
And then?
Then I found a field. And a tree. And a rope.
I'm so sorry, Judas. Truly.
All these centuries, and that moment still feels like yesterday. The despair was total, complete. I couldn't see any path to redemption. Any way to undo what I had set in motion. They say Jesus asked God to forgive those who crucified him. I wonder sometimes if that forgiveness extended to me. I never stayed to find out.
There's a theological perspective that suggests your role was necessary, that without the betrayal, there would have been no crucifixion, and without the crucifixion, no resurrection, no salvation.
So I've heard. Small comfort, isn't it, to be told your greatest shame was all part of God's plan. If that's true, what does it say about free will, about my own soul? Was I merely a pawn, predestined for damnation so others could be saved?
What do you think?
I think God's ways are indeed mysterious. I think perhaps my story has been oversimplified. The betrayer, the villain, the counterpoint to Peter's denial and subsequent redemption. It's neater that way, isn't it? More satisfying narratively. But the truth is always more complex.
Have you heard of the Gospel of Judas? It's a text discovered much later that presents you in a very different light, as Jesus' closest confidant, acting on his instructions.
I've heard of it, yes. Another simplification, just in the opposite direction. The truth lies somewhere in between, I think. I was neither purely villain nor secret hero. Just a man, with all the complexity that entails. A man who made a terrible mistake, whose actions had consequences far beyond what he could have imagined.
If you could go back to that night, would you make a different choice?
With what I know now? Of course. But that's not how life works, is it? We make choices based on who we are and what we know in the moment. The man I was then believed he was doing what needed to be done. The man I became afterward, well, he didn't give himself the chance to make amends.
What would you want people today to understand about you?
That I was human. Flawed, yes. Tragically mistaken, certainly. But human. Not some cosmic embodiment of evil. Just a man who loved his people, who wanted liberation, who followed a teacher he didn't fully understand and who made a catastrophic error in judgment. I would want them to consider what it means to truly follow someone, whether you follow them for who they actually are, or for who you want them to be.
That's a profound insight, Judas. Thank you for sharing your story with such honesty. I know it can't be easy to revisit these painful memories.
After 2,000 years, one gets used to the pain, though speaking of it aloud, that's different. Thank you for listening without judgment. That's rare in my experience.
Of course. What struck me most in our conversation was how human your experience was, the hopes, the disappointments, the misunderstandings that can happen in any relationship, but with the most profound consequences imaginable in your case. I wonder, was there a particular teaching of Jesus that has stayed with you all this time? Something that still resonates?
There was a time when he said, "Greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends." The irony, of course, is that while he demonstrated this love through his death, I have been forever remembered as the antithesis of it, as one who valued 30 pieces of silver over a friend's life. But I've often wondered if, in some paradoxical way, my act was also a kind of laying down my life. Not physically in that moment, but sacrificing my place in history, my reputation, my very soul as it's been understood. Not that I'm claiming nobility in what I did, far from it, but the complexity of it all haunts me.
That's a perspective I've never considered before. It's giving me a lot to think about. What would you say to others who have made mistakes that seem beyond redemption, who carry the weight of actions they cannot undo?
I would say, don't do what I did. Don't let despair have the final word. I ended my story when perhaps it was only beginning. Who knows what might have happened if I had lived, if I had faced Jesus after the resurrection, if I had sought forgiveness instead of punishment. The rope was my choice, not his. Remember that even Peter, who denied Jesus 3 times, found redemption. The difference between us wasn't in our failure, but in our response to it.
Thank you for sharing that perspective, Judas. I think many of our listeners will find comfort in that message. Now let's open the floor to some questions that have come in from our audience. This is one of my favorite parts of the show. Here's our first question from a listener named Marcus Aurelius from Rome. He writes, "Throughout history, you've been portrayed as greedy and motivated by money, yet you say the silver wasn't your primary motivation. What do you think is the biggest misconception about your character that you'd like to correct?"
Thank you for that question, Marcus. The portrayal of me as primarily motivated by greed is perhaps the most painful misconception. The 30 pieces of silver have become such a powerful symbol that they've overshadowed everything else about my story. But as I tried to explain earlier, my motivations were complex: political disillusionment, a misguided attempt to force Jesus to act, personal disappointment. The money was almost an afterthought, a detail in a much larger tragedy. If I could correct one thing, it would be the reduction of my entire existence to the one who betrayed Jesus for money. There was so much more to it than that.
That's a powerful clarification, Judas. I think many of us are guilty of reducing complex historical figures to their single most famous act or attribute. Our next question comes from Sophia Chen from San Francisco. She asks, I've struggled with feelings of betrayal from someone I trusted deeply. What advice would you give to someone trying to process and heal from betrayal, based on your unique perspective of having been on the other side of it?
Sophia, that's a deeply personal question, and I'm moved that you would ask it of me, of all people. From my perspective, I would say first, recognize that betrayal is rarely as simple as it appears. The person who betrayed you likely had their own complex reasons, their own pain, their own misguided beliefs that led to their actions. This doesn't excuse what they did, but understanding that complexity might help you make sense of it. Second, consider what healing looks like for you. Does it require confrontation, forgiveness, distance? Only you can determine that. And finally, this is the hardest part. Consider whether there might be a future beyond this pain. Jesus, even knowing I would betray him, still broke bread with me, still called me friend. There was an openness there, a door left ajar, that I chose not to walk through. Don't let the betrayal define you, or determine your future, as I allowed it to define mine.
That's incredibly wise counsel, Judas. Thank you for that thoughtful response. One more question from our listeners. This one is from Javier Rodriguez in Madrid. He asks, if you could have one conversation with Jesus now, after everything that's happened and all you've learned, what would you say to him?
One conversation. I've imagined this scenario countless times over the centuries. What would I say? First, I would apologize, not just for the betrayal, but for misunderstanding him so profoundly, for trying to force him into being the Messiah I wanted, rather than accepting the Messiah he was. I would ask him if what happened was truly necessary, if there was no other way for his mission to be fulfilled. And I would ask him about forgiveness, whether it truly extends to everyone, even to me. But mostly, I think I would just want to listen, to hear his voice again, to have him explain what it all meant, what the purpose was. I still don't fully understand why things happened as they did. Maybe no one does.
Thank you, Judas. Your honesty is deeply moving. And thank you to all our listeners who sent in questions. I want to express my gratitude to you, Judas, for engaging with these difficult questions so thoughtfully. And a big thank you to all of you listening to us right now. We truly appreciate you tuning in to our show. Let's now move to some questions from our live audience. Is there anyone here who would like to ask Judas a question? I see a hand up over there. Let me come to you. You know, crossing a room full of eager audience members is a bit like navigating the Sea of Galilee during a storm. You never know when a wave of enthusiasm might knock you over. Hello there. What's your name? Rebecca from Toronto. Lovely to meet you, Rebecca. What question would you like to ask our guest today? Oh, that's a fascinating question. I hadn't thought about that aspect before. Judas, Rebecca here wants to know how you felt about the other disciples writing the Gospels and essentially shaping the narrative about you that would persist for millennia. Did you ever wish you could have told your own story?
Rebecca, that's an excellent question. Yes, it's been difficult, to put it mildly, having my story told exclusively by others. The Gospels were written decades after the events they describe, by men who had their own theological agendas. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. They each portrayed me slightly differently, but always as the villain of the story. John was particularly harsh, calling me a thief and claiming the devil entered me. I wasn't there to defend myself, to explain my actions, to provide context. So yes, I've wished countless times that I could have told my own story. The Gospel of Judas that Lily mentioned earlier was not written by me. It was composed centuries later by Gnostic Christians, with their own theological perspective. My actual thoughts, my actual motivations, my actual words. They died with me in that field outside Jerusalem. What remains is interpretation, symbolism, theological necessity.
Thank you for that candid response. It must be strange to have your identity so shaped by others' perceptions. Let's take another question from the audience. Anyone else? Yes, you, sir, in the back. I'm making my way to you now. The acoustics in this studio are really something, aren't they? Every footstep echoes like we're in the Temple of Jerusalem. Hello there. What's your name? Daniel from Chicago. Great to have you here, Daniel. What would you like to ask Judas? Oh, that's a very profound theological question. I'm curious to hear the answer myself. Judas, Daniel asks about your understanding of salvation after everything you've experienced. He wonders, do you believe in redemption, and what do you think it takes for a soul to be saved?
That cuts to the heart of everything, doesn't it, Daniel? My understanding of salvation has evolved, let's say. During my life with Jesus, I understood salvation primarily in political terms. Liberation from Roman occupation, the restoration of Israel, justice for the oppressed. Jesus spoke of something more spiritual, more eternal, but I struggled to fully grasp it. After my death, as Christianity spread and developed its theology, I watched from afar, so to speak. I saw how Paul and others articulated a vision of salvation through faith in Christ's sacrificial death and resurrection. And I wondered, where did I fit in that narrative? Was I excluded from that grace by the very act that made it possible? As for what I believe now, I believe salvation is more expansive than many religious systems allow for. I believe it has less to do with adhering to correct doctrine, and more to do with the orientation of one's heart toward love, toward justice, toward compassion, the very things Jesus embodied. And I believe, or perhaps I simply hope, that no one is beyond redemption, not even me.
Thank you for that thoughtful response, Judas. It's fascinating to hear how your perspective has developed over time. Let's take one final question from our audience. I see a hand raised over there. Yes, you, in the red shirt. Coming your way now. You know, moving through crowds always reminds me of that story where Jesus couldn't get through because there were so many people, and someone lowered a paralyzed man through the roof. Fortunately, our ceiling is much sturdier. Hello there. What's your name? Mei Ling from Singapore. It's wonderful to have international viewers in our audience. What would you like to ask our guest? Oh, that's a question about legacy and meaning that I think will resonate with many of us. Judas, Mei Ling asks whether you think your story has value for people today, and what lessons you hope people might take from your experience.
Mei Ling, thank you for that thoughtful question. I do believe my story has value, perhaps now more than ever. We live in a world of increasing polarization, where it's easy to cast others as villains, as entirely good or entirely evil. My story is a reminder of the complexity of human motivation, the danger of reducing people to their worst moments, and the tragic consequences that can arise from misunderstanding and rigid expectations. I hope people might learn to look beyond simplified narratives, to consider the full humanity of those labeled as enemies or betrayers. I hope they might recognize how easy it is to betray our own values when we feel disappointed or disillusioned. And most importantly, I hope they might learn what I learned too late, that despair is never the final answer, that the story doesn't have to end at the moment of greatest failure. There is always another chapter possible if we're willing to live it.
What a powerful note to end on. Thank you to everyone who asked questions, and thank you, Judas, for your remarkable candor and insight. Let's all give our guest another round of applause as I make my way back to the stage.
Thank you, Lily. These questions weren't easy, but they were important. I appreciate the opportunity to engage with them.
It's we who should be thanking you, Judas. Your willingness to revisit such painful memories and reflect on them with such depth is truly remarkable. Which question resonated most with you, dear listeners? Take a moment to reflect on what you've heard today. I have some personal questions I've been eager to ask you as well, Judas, if you don't mind. If you hadn't become a follower of Jesus, what path do you think your life might have taken?
That's a question I've pondered many times. Given my education and abilities with money, I likely would have pursued a career as a merchant, or perhaps even a scribe. I had a practical mind, and in another life, I might have found success in business or administration. I might have married, had children, lived a quiet life in Kerioth. It's strange to think about, that ordinary, unremarkable life that might have been. No infamy, no place in history books, just one man among many. There are moments when I long for that anonymity, that simplicity. But then I remember the extraordinary things I witnessed following Jesus, and despite how it ended, I can't bring myself to regret having been part of it.
That's a fascinating glimpse into the road not taken. Sometimes I think we all wonder about those alternate lives we might have lived. Here's something I've always wondered. Were there moments of doubt even before the final week? Times when you questioned whether Jesus was truly the Messiah?
Yes, absolutely. Doubt was a constant companion, though it waxed and waned. There were times when Jesus would say or do something that seemed to contradict what I understood about the Messiah. His emphasis on serving rather than being served. His reluctance to directly challenge Roman authority. His talk of his own death. These things confused me. But then there would be moments, a healing I couldn't explain, a teaching that pierced straight to my heart, a display of knowledge that seemed impossible, and my faith would be renewed. I think all the disciples experienced doubt at various points. The difference is they stayed through it. Their doubt was a phase in their faith journey. Mine became a catalyst for betrayal.
Thank you for that honest answer. I think many people of faith will relate to that experience of doubt as a constant companion, even in the midst of belief. Right, I have an idea. Why don't we play a quiz game about Judas for our audience? What do you think?
A quiz about me? That's unexpected, but why not? I'm curious to see what people know or think they know about my story.
Come on, let's have some music for our quiz. All right, here's our first quiz question about Judas. I want everyone in our studio audience to participate. If you think option A is correct, make a fist and raise it. If you think option B is correct, raise an open palm. Here's the question. In the Gospel accounts, did Judas leave the Last Supper before or after Jesus instituted what is now called communion or the Eucharist? Option A, before the bread and wine were shared. Option B, after participating in the bread and wine. Interesting. I'm seeing a pretty even split in our audience. Maybe slightly more people think Judas stayed for the communion. Judas, what's the correct answer?
This is actually a point of disagreement among the Gospel accounts. In John's Gospel, I left immediately after receiving the dipped bread, which would be before the institution of the communion as it's now understood. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the timeline is less clear, but it can be interpreted that I was present for the sharing of bread and wine. The traditional interpretation, however, has generally been that I left before this sacred moment, partly because it's theologically neater that way. The betrayer shouldn't share in the sacred meal that symbolizes Christ's sacrifice. But the text itself is ambiguous.
Fascinating. I never realized there was such complexity even in the timeline of events. It seems like many of our historical certainties are actually based on traditional interpretations rather than clear textual evidence. Let's try another question. Again, fist for A, open palm for B. Here's the question. According to tradition, what happened to the 30 pieces of silver that Judas returned to the temple? Option A, the priests used it to buy a potter's field as a burial place for foreigners. Option B, the money was put back into the temple treasury. It looks like most of our audience is going with option A this time. There seems to be more consensus here. Judas, what's the correct answer?
The correct answer is A. According to Matthew's Gospel, the chief priests decided they couldn't put the money back into the temple treasury because it was blood money, so they used it to buy a field from a potter to serve as a burial place for foreigners. That field became known as the Field of Blood. There's a certain irony there. My blood money ultimately provided a resting place for those who had no place. Perhaps there's a metaphor in that, though I'm not sure what it would be.
Thank you, Judas. It's remarkable how these small details have been preserved in the historical record and continue to be discussed centuries later. By the way, I got both answers correct. Well, that's because I wrote the questions myself. And that concludes our quiz portion for today. Thank you, Judas, for being such a good sport and engaging with these questions about your own story. I'm afraid we're getting close to the end of our time together today.
I appreciate the sentiment behind that reaction. It's not often I receive such a warm response from an audience.
It's been an absolutely fascinating conversation, hasn't it? We've covered so much ground today, from your initial attraction to Jesus' ministry and your role among the disciples, to the complex political context of first-century Judea, to the fateful decisions that led to that night in Gethsemane.
Yes, we've traversed through some difficult terrain. What strikes me, reflecting on our conversation, is how relevant these ancient events remain. The tensions between idealism and pragmatism, between expectation and reality, between loyalty to a cause and loyalty to a person, these are still very much with us today.
That's so true. And I think one of the most valuable aspects of your perspective is how it reminds us that historical figures were real people with complex motivations, not just symbols or archetypes.
If there's one thing I'd want people to take away from this conversation, it's the importance of examining their own expectations, especially expectations of others. I projected onto Jesus what I wanted him to be, what I needed him to be, for my own worldview to make sense. When he didn't conform to that image, I couldn't adapt. I couldn't see that perhaps his vision was larger, more profound than mine. That failure of imagination led to tragedy.
That's a powerful insight, Judas. Thank you for sharing it with us.
Thank you, Lily, and thank you to your audience for listening, with such openness and curiosity. After centuries of being defined solely by my worst moment, it means more than I can express to be heard as a complete person. Flawed and broken, yes, but human. Not just a betrayer, but Judas Iscariot, a man who loved, who believed, who failed, and who has spent eternity contemplating the meaning of it all. May your journeys be wiser than mine.
And thank you all for listening today, whether you're commuting, doing household chores, or just taking some time for yourself. Your engagement makes this show possible. What part of today's interview made the strongest impression on you? Take a moment to reflect on what you've heard. Now it's time for our Quote of the Day segment. Let's have the music, please. Today's quote is this. The greatest mistake you can make in life is to continually fear you will make one. One more time. The greatest mistake you can make in life is to continually fear you will make one. This quote comes from Elbert Hubbard, an American writer, publisher, and philosopher who lived from 1856 to 1915. Hubbard was known for founding the Roycroft Artisan Community and for his series of biographical sketches called Little Journeys to the Homes of the Great. I find this quote particularly relevant after our conversation with Judas today. Judas's story is, in many ways, defined by mistakes, both the mistake of betrayal itself and perhaps the greater mistake of allowing that betrayal to be the final word on his life. But there's wisdom in recognizing that fear of making mistakes can paralyze us, prevent us from taking necessary risks, from growing, from fully engaging with life. You know, I once had a cooking teacher who told me that the difference between a novice and a master chef isn't that the master never makes mistakes. It's that the master knows how to incorporate the mistakes into the dish. I tried that approach when I accidentally put salt instead of sugar in my cookies last week, and, well, let's just say some mistakes are harder to salvage than others. What do you think about today's quote? Does it resonate with your own experiences? We're truly approaching the end of our program now. Time flies when you're having such a fascinating conversation. I want to remind all of our wonderful listeners to subscribe to our show, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comment section. We'd love to hear what you thought about today's interview with Judas Iscariot and who you'd like to see on future episodes of Background Interview. Your support through the QR code in the bottom right corner of the video or through the links in the description really helps keep this show going. We put a lot of research and production effort into bringing these conversations to you. And yes, that support is where my salary comes from too. While this interview is perfect for background listening as you go about your day, I also want to recommend our full podcast series and playlists. They're great for those times when you're feeling lonely and need some engaging conversation, or even as a thoughtful alternative to counting sheep when you're trying to fall asleep. As mentioned in our channel description, we offer these interviews in 12 different languages, which is also a fantastic resource if you're learning a new language. I actually listen to our French versions myself to brush up on my skills, though my accent still makes native speakers wince a little. Our next guest is also someone extremely famous, a figure whose presence on this show will definitely raise some eyebrows. I can't reveal who it is just yet, but I promise it will be an episode you won't want to miss. Until next time, thank you for joining us on Background Interview. I'm your host, Lily, wishing you thought-provoking background listening wherever your day takes you. Thank you all. Good night. Phew, that was intense. So much heavier than I expected. You know what I really wanted to ask him but couldn't bring myself to? Whether he thinks Dante got it right, putting him in the lowest circle of hell. I mean, that's where he's been in the popular imagination for centuries. Frozen in the mouth of Satan alongside Brutus and Cassius, the three greatest betrayers in history. But after talking with him, hearing the complexity of his story, I just couldn't bring myself to ask about that literary representation. It seemed too cruel somehow. But maybe someday I'll find the courage to ask that question. Join us next time for another fascinating episode of Background Interview.